So as we move into a conversation around police violence, I want to just name that we will be having very difficult conversation interrogating state violence. As you've seen during the poetry section, you can ask questions at any time. Sarah Whipple, who is currently hosting the meeting, will receive those questions and collect them for the Q&A session at the close of the conversation. You'll also see in that chat box that if you want to be on the email list for updates to the TeachIn series, as well as links to resources and follow-up action items, in addition to links for the recorded YouTube sessions, you can send that. You can click on the link and sign up. I also want to thank the School of Arts and Humanities, the Gender Center, and the Office of Community Engagement for their time, labor, and vision for this ongoing series. As Sarah is preparing our, the participants in our conversation and preparing the screens to set up, I think it's really important that before we start this discussion, we acknowledge that this TeachIn series is taking place on occupied Indigenous lands. We recognize the people of the Comanche, the Apache, Caddo, Kickapoo, Kiowa, and Wichita nations and their descendants as the original caretakers of this land. We recognize the presence of all other nations who are not explicitly mentioned in this acknowledgement. We also recognize displaced Indigenous communities throughout this land who may not necessarily be a part of these nations. We acknowledge that the US state federal government has displaced and continued to displace Indigenous peoples. We recognize that Texas was and is a part of Aztlan, the homeland of Mexica peoples. We honor Indigenous cultural and ancestral connections to the land that we stand on, as well as the waters of the sacred springs that we walk along. We recognize that Indigenous peoples are present with us today. We acknowledge the historical traumas of colonialism, and we aim to honor and respect Indigenous peoples, their sovereignty, culture, customs, and beliefs. Right? And we respect those who are in the process of reclaiming their indigeneity. I'm so grateful to the participants who have joined our conversation today. I will introduce them shortly, but this has been a uniquely intense summer, especially for those working to resist state violence. So our guests today have generously carved out time to speak with us. I also want to name before we begin our conversation that border policing, ICE, xenophobia, this will not be a specific focus of our conversation today, but we do have one such conversation scheduled for the fall, so please do sign up for that email list, keep an eye out, and stay tuned for the exact date for that conversation. I want to start today by offering some brief thoughts on the history of policing, right? I want to think about the future by looking to the past. And I want to be clear that in this history, my concern is not with individual officers, right? My concern is with the deeply rooted historical structures of policing that continue to shape our everyday experiences. Law enforcement on this land is rooted in foundational violence, the violence of patriarchy, colonization, and slavery. Law and order on this land has historically meant enforcing white property and white wealth through the theft, dispossession, and forced labor of Black and Indigenous men, women, and children. In other words, law and order, when viewed from the perspective of subjugated people, has historically meant criminalization. Prior to the lethal advent of European colonization, there was no such thing as prisons and police on this land. Many indigenous nations practiced what we would call today community-based restorative justice, a process of collective decision-making that centered on repairing harm and caring for the whole community. The Spanish established some of the first prisons on this land, locking up and guarding indigenous women and girls in order to segregate and regulate them. By incarcerating these women and girls, Europeans introduced and imposed sexist hierarchies and gender binaries. As the English brutally dominated the land, police, jails, and prisons became a tool of subjugation, right, to force indigenous people to perform labor for whites and to punish them if they refused. Racist myths that indigenous people were drunk and disorderly helped to justify their criminalization. And criminalization itself became the primary method to extract coerced labor from indigenous people. In the West, in particular, incarcerated indigenous men and women, so-called convict workers, built the earliest roads, bridges, and buildings, and performed domestic labor in white people's homes. Colonization and law enforcement worked hand in hand. Slavery and law enforcement also worked hand in hand. Slavery was a legal regime. I can't stress this enough. Slavery was legal. Right? Therefore, law enforcement literally meant enforcing slavery. Some of the earliest police forces were deployed to surveil and patrol enslaved men, women, and children. After the Civil War, slavery became illegal with one major loophole. Right? Slavery was ruled unconstitutional in the 13th Amendment, but with the devastating exception for people convicted of crimes. White property owners wrote new laws that robbed Black people of the freedoms they had fought so hard to win: the freedom to vote, to work for themselves, to live and love as they desired. Police in this historical moment were deployed then to reimpose a white supremacist order. Black people were rounded up and arrested simply for how they looked and how they lived. For example, in 1890, Black men and women were sentenced to hard labor for charges that ranged from adultery to, quote, using abusive language. The Civil War accelerated industrialization in this nation. And by the early 20th century, cities were booming across the US. In these cities, the police were deployed to protect the enormous profits of industrial bosses. As workers, especially European and Latinx immigrants and Black people, organized for safer labor conditions and living wages, the police were on the picket lines to beat back organized labor and to brutally attack the men and women who went on strike. In these early 20th century cities too, police were charged with establishing, quote, social order, right, which was defined as racially segregated, patriarchal family units with a male head of household. Queer and gender nonconforming people and women who lived independently were routinely targeted as criminals. So I'm stopping this history in the 1920s. Right? There's still a century of history to go. And yet to me, this deep past has powerful resonances with our present. As we consider this history, we must ask ourselves, who have the police historically protected? Whose safety did the police prioritize? In this murderous history of theft and brutality, who was considered criminal and who was considered innocent? The concept of police as servants of public safety or community partners is very new, right? It's a nanosecond in the longer history of law enforcement on this land. As we imagine a future of safety, care, and dignity, we must ask, how can we reconcile the history of law enforcement with our contemporary society? So the participants of the TeachIn will now offer their contributions based on their experiences and their expertise. We'll go in this order, and I'll introduce each participant prior to their contribution. So we'll start with Jody Voice Yellowfish. We'll move to Chris Robinson, Bryson Royal, and then Sarah McCoria, I'm very glad to announce, will also be joining us today. So I'll begin by introducing Jody Voice Yellowfish. Jody is Muscogee Creek, Oglala Lakota, and Cherokee. A product of the US government's relocation program, Jody was born and raised in Dallas and has lived in Oak Cliff her entire life. She attended Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, where she received her associate's degree in social work and studied for her bachelor's in Indigenous and American Indian Studies. Jody is an ambassador for American Indian Heritage Day in Texas, Indian Citizens Against Racial Exploitation, as well as chair Murdered Indigenous Women, Texas. Jody's also a member of the steering committee for Dallas Truth Racial Healing Transformation, and also with Our City, Our Future. Jody is an adoptive parent, and we are so glad to learn from Jody today. Thank you, Jody.
Hi everyone. I'm really, really honored to be a part of this group of people to discuss this really heavy but really important conversation. Yeah, so I guess to kind of touch on, looking at historically who police have protected and looking at those who have police prioritized and that historical context. You get asked these questions often, but when you think about it in a historical context, I feel like it's still the same. A lot hasn't changed looking at historically and contemporary issues with policing. And I feel like the police have historically protected, property. And when you think about, protecting property, that includes, slavery and viewing people as property. And when this happens, there's this immediate view of viewing people as disposable, like they don't matter, like they don't deserve protection, that they're less than. And these violent actions to make that a truth and a fact still in place. Things dealing with colonization and patriarchy still affect people of color, their lives daily. And it's just I think that's the priority when it comes to policing and understanding property and ownership, and understanding that all of these things just those are the core values that uphold white supremacy, and that's what we're dealing with on the daily, I think. I don't know if I if I touched on everything that I needed to at that moment.
Thank you, Jody. That was wonderful. Next, we'll hear from Chris Robinson. Chris is an organizer with Faith in Texas and works to get more college and university students and young adults active in their communities, politics, and social justice. Chris is from Dallas, and before attending college in Arkansas, he graduated from the Center of Law and Public Safety program at Grand Prairie High School. While pursuing a double major in political science and economics, Chris participated in building a county-wide program in Arkansas that dropped the crime rate by 45% and dropped the unemployment rate by almost 35%. In addition to his role at Faith in Texas, Chris is a high school coach. He believes that young adults and college students are vital in bringing much-needed change to our communities, and he hopes to coach young adults to not only prosper in life, but to make a difference in the lives of others. Thank you so much, Chris.
Yes, yes. Good afternoon to all. It's an honor and a privilege to just be invited and to just be a part of what y'all are doing here. This is fantastic. It is amazing. I will give a little history, just a little bit more history behind it. I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas. And growing up, I always had, the thought of everyday life is I'm going to see the police every day. I'm going to see violence every day. I'm going to see oppression every day. But it wasn't those things to me. It was just an everyday life. Like it was just how it's what I was born into, raised into is just, life. And it wasn't until I became a freshman in high school, and we started the Center of Law and Public Safety at Grand Prairie when I started realizing that this is not how life is for everyone. And I started realizing very quickly that when I started, gaining friends with influence, which means money and property, and their family had some wealth behind them, I started quickly realizing that my life and their life were extremely different, not just because they had, let's say, money, property, or influence. Their interactions, with society was completely different than my interaction with society. And when we go through talking about who have police, protected and prioritized through my college, education, and like I said, my personal experience is they have prioritized, as was stated by Jody, is they prioritize against. They prioritize for property, but also they also prioritize around money, wealth. They so whoever has the bigger pockets, the bigger bank account, whoever has the property and the study in economics, those two go hand in hand. If you have money, then you have property. If you have property, then you have power. So money and property equals power. And that's also what is prioritized by our current policing system is power. So um, it has been historically uh, set up to where certain individuals, and I mean certain individuals, not a group of people, a certain individuals have power, and groups of people are set up and meant to not have power. And so when we're talking about who do this policing system keep safe, it has been historically proven, especially with the ties to slavery and slave patrol, it has been historically proven that it is the indigenous community, the black community, the Latinx community that has been, historically um, left out of safety and left to wander a world of unsafety. Um, and it's also been just even my current day work. When I say I want to get involved with students, I feel that students recognize this a lot sooner than I did, and have bright ideas of kind of sort of how we can move about and reimagine kind of sort of what does safety mean. And a project that I always start off with is when you imagine a perfect day in your life, just a perfect day. Do you see a police officer? So that's my spiel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Really important questions to think about. Next, I'm so pleased that we'll be joined by Bryson Royal. Bryson is a senior electrical engineering student here at UT Dallas. He's been involved in organizations on campus, such as the National Society for Black Engineers and the Black Student Alliance. Bryson is currently the lab manager for the ArtSci Lab, a research lab in ATEC. And in his free time, he enjoys reading novels and comic books, drawing, and listening to music. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bryson.
Hello, I'm Bryson Royal. I just want to say first, thank you for having me. Because I am very long-winded, I will go ahead and dive into my spiel. I have about 5 minutes, and I apologize if I take all 5. So the reason why I was invited today, or one of the reasons why I was invited today, is because I've been very vocal about an experience that I had with the police very recently. So essentially, what happened, I was in my apartment one day. I hear this beating on the door, and people who've had interactions with the police before, we know when police are beating at the door. So I end up opening the door to several barrels of guns. So I get pulled out of my room, put in handcuffs, and they start asking me questions. So come to find out, the roommate that I was living with at the time called the police and told them that his roommate was standing outside of his door with a loaded weapon. So after that, once we got that all figured out and once we ironed everything out, essentially the police started shuffling out. You know, I walked back into the room. Once they had figured everything out and parsed everything out, they took away that roommate in handcuffs. I walked back in the room with my hands up, and they're like, "Hey, no, man, you're totally good." And I said, "Hey, no, I'm not. You know, I'm good." So I have a father who is who was, before he retired, a Dallas firefighter. So he's always been very vocal with me about the police and their merits, but also has been very vocal about the police and their detriments and the things that they do to maintain their power and what they do to protect their property and the property of those with power. So I admired the class analysis put into place by Jody, Chris, and Ann in the conversations that took place before me. And I would like to add there, they do protect property and they do protect power, but on a smaller but equally important level, they protected the comfort of those with both. So in my conversations that I had with my roommate after, I ended up telling him, "Hey man, I have to say, you've lived with roommates and been using drugs in this apartment for a long time. So while you're telling me that this was totally the result of the drugs you used, why has this never happened with anyone else before? And why is this the first time this has happened? What is the difference here besides me being a new person, looking how I look and being how I am?" So I think in all of this, and after everything happened, and sorry to go on a little bit longer, the next day I had to basically call the police because I was trying to move out of that apartment to get out, because the police told me he could be back within a couple of hours if his toxicology report comes back clear. So I ended up calling UTD police and asking them, "Hey, could you escort me to my room? Could you look inside? Could you make sure that he's not there?" They say, "Sorry, not in our jurisdiction, call Richardson police." I call Richardson police. They end up saying, essentially, I get met with this very dismissive officer who says, "Well, we're not going to do that. You know, if you decide to go back there and move your stuff out, then whatever." So then we call UTD again. They tell us no again. So then me and my father, we go to the UTD police department headquarters on campus, which is right across the street from Northside, where I live, to be clear on that. We end up talking to them and I say, "Hey, this person, the police did a search warrant on his room. He had a gun in his room that he was not supposed to have. How am I supposed to stay safe?" And one question that my father asked that my mom tried to encourage him not to ask, and this was that I thought was because my father said, "Okay, so if you guys are refusing to come up to the apartment and you guys are saying we don't want to, what's stopping me and a few of my friends as legally carrying gun owners from protecting my son?" And he said, "Would you be okay if we all got guns and protected my son?" And they said, "Oh, whoa, don't do that." So then me and my father both basically just looked at him like, "All right then, so what are you going to do?" So then they ended up coming. We were met with a couple of officers. You could tell that they were a little bit irritated to be there. And they ended up just peeking inside the room, closing the door and leaving. So I had a lot of conversations with the police officers. The police officers who were on the scene at the time, I don't have too many grievances with them because they did, in essence, what you're supposed to do when you get a call saying that someone is in the room with a gun. But the main reason and the main thing that I want to talk about here is that beyond the conversation, the very important conversation that we need to have on police and police violence is how that violence is weaponized against those who are disenfranchised and who weaponizes those institutions and who do the institutions benefit. And one point, and the last point that I'll make, sorry, I'm coming at the end of my 5 minutes. I ended up asking, I said, "Hey, when this guy called and said that there is a crazy guy outside of my room with a gun, you guys came with 20 officers. But somehow when I say there might be someone in my room who has already threatened my life as far as I'm concerned, you guys can't even send one officer to check up on me." And that to me distilled down to its base level, the inequities in policing and how policing is exercised on minority communities and white communities. So that is kind of the genesis of my conversation today, and kind of the ideas that I wanted to propagate in this section. So yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Bryson, for sharing that story and your excellent analysis of it, of your experiences. Well, I'm also thrilled to announce we have a surprise guest. Sarah McCoria has joined us today. Sarah is the Associate Director for Leadership Initiatives at the Institute for Urban Policy Research here at UT Dallas. She holds a bachelor's degree from New School University and 2 master's degrees from Simmons College. In addition to her work on campus, Sarah is a co-founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, a founding partner of the Steward Cultural Development Group, and a co-founder of Young Leaders Strong City. Sarah is a mother and lives with her family here in Dallas. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was trying to adjust my hair in this light. Not great lighting. I hope you all are well. So, hi, UTD family. Hi, Jody, and everyone else. I am also a member of Our City, Our Future, so I'm so happy to be here with my colleague Jody and with so many of you. This has been a really interesting conversation. Hold on, I'm sorry. This has been a really interesting conversation and a really important one. And I think that, I'm sorry, you all, I'm having technical issues. Hold on one second. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about my technical issues. But I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. I apologize again. I think that listening to my colleagues have really solidified what our issues with policing are in this country. And this moment more than ever has amplified the need for us to discuss what actually keeps our public safe. What do we need to be safe as a public? And as Bryson talked, it reminded me of the 1950s in Dallas when Black folks who were moving into South Dallas, their homes were being bombed as a racial terroristic program to intimidate against integration. And the Black community at the time called in the state troopers for support and help against this racial terrorist violence, and were told no. Yet last summer, those same troopers, obviously not the same exact troopers, but the same institution, the same group, came into South Dallas and gave out thousands of tickets. And the summer ended with a 27-year-old Mr. Hodge being killed after being stopped for a failure to use signal light. And so we see this difference of the same group, the troopers, in their response. Who do they protect? Who are they protecting? why are they protecting it? Who are they protecting from, and what are they protecting from? And so I think when we, Chris talked about what does your perfect day look like, and does that perfect day include police? I would even expand that question to say, what makes you feel safe, and are we investing our public dollars into what make us actually feel safe? Does policing as an institution work? I would say no, because when you look at over policing, brutality that folks of color, poor folks, genderqueer folks are experiencing, we see that it must change. But when you also look at wealthy white communities, you notice that they're paying for private security forces. You see cameras, you see gates, you see fences. This makes me, this highlights the fact that they also do not feel safe. So I say that to say, on the full spectrum of our community and our society, we are not feeling safe and connected and protected in the ways that we need to. And so we must think about alternative ways to invest in public safety. And I would suggest that requires us looking outside of policing as an institution. So I look forward to continuing the conversation. I don't want to take up too much time. I have so much to say. People who know me know that, but I'm happy to continue the conversation and through dialogue. So thank you all for having me here.
Oh, these comments were so provocative and so important. And I just want to amplify some of the themes that I've been hearing, right? That in one sense, right, policing feels extremely zero-sum. The protection of elite, predominantly white, right, rich communities at the expense of targeted communities, right? Whether they are marginalized because of institutional racism, transphobia, right? Ongoing colonial projects. Right? So if there is an argument, right, that the day without police, right, that is the everyday experience of elite white people, but that safety, that invisibility of police for them is funded by this deep well of violence that is a violence that is brought to the door of so many marginalized and dispossessed communities here in Dallas, right? But as Sarah rightly points out, even those elite white folks don't feel safe, right? They are still continuing to invest even more in private technologies of surveillance and security. I want to ask, I'm very eager to get to the questions of what makes you feel safe and how we can imagine a perfect day. But before I do that, I just want to ask our panelists to speak to the theme, right, of this conversation, the living legacies of white supremacy. And I want to ask each of the panelists, right, how have your experiences with police shaped your relationship to Dallas, right, or shaped your relationship to your community? In other words, how do we see these living legacies playing out in your everyday lives, right? And how does that shape your relationship to your own city and community?
Is there a specific order that you would like to go in? Sorry.
Oh, you know what? It's Zoom. I'm sorry. If you'd like to speak, you can go ahead and just show me, but otherwise maybe we can see each other's faces now. So feel free to chime in if no one looks like they're about to speak as well.
So I suppose, oh, Joey, were you about to say something? I'll let you go first. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Just thinking about my own personal experiences in Dallas. The first thing, having these conversations around policing, especially in Dallas, you get asked that question, what has your experiences with the police been? And, I always think about, the any of the work that I'm doing around understanding policing or anything like that, it's centered around, what Sarah said, what makes you feel safe? When do you feel safe? How do you feel safe? And, my first thoughts of police, of course, go back to when I was really young, child. I've lived in the hood my whole life. I grew up in Oak Cliff. I grew up in Dallas, and I feel safe. I felt safe in my community, and never would I say the police made me feel safe. Um, you know, living in these poor communities and dealing with historical traumas and intergenerational traumas. We people of color, we have, we deal with more mental health crisis than other people, and I've seen that my whole life. I've seen, like what the protocol is today in Dallas is 5 uniformed police officers are called for a mental health crisis. And when you're a kid and you see this up and down your blocks in your neighborhood, it's scary. When you know that, somebody just needs help and not to be criminalized for being or, existing basically. And, existing with these traumas that you have no control over, seeing who's criminalized with not engaging in criminal activity, seeing that, the people that are criminalized the most are those in need. The people that need the most help are the ones criminalized. Criminalizing poverty, that's what I grew up with. That's what set the tone for my life, and seeing police in my city. So that naturally shapes your entire life in dealing with the police. So it's like I can say, of course, yeah, you go to another side of town, you're going to get followed when you go to the store. Things like that. It's like that's a given. Those that doesn't even need to be asked anymore. But it's those things of seeing uniformed officers manhandle somebody for being out of medication and their family can't handle the situation. And when those things come up, people have asked, like I would never call the cops on somebody in a crisis. There are a lot of situations that require a person to need more help. Being elderly, having somebody that's just physically strong in a situation. I've seen that personally within my family, and I've seen the emotional toll that takes on somebody to make that judgment call when you have to physically protect yourself in a situation. And, there's with guns and bulletproof vests, they don't help the situation. So it's those things have set the tone for how I see everything, with the police in my life and, my loved ones' lives. And, with those things setting the tone, dealing with MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous women, are the core of our work is helping families search for loved ones or seek justice in different ways. We kind of fill in those gaps, which is hard. When you've grown up seeing how the police are, when you need to work with the police, to seek justice for families, like it's really hard. Seeing how, having friends run away, not seeing them again, or, having parents or grandparents come to you for help. And you have to deal with the people that, you don't feel safe with. That's our everyday is understanding, we don't know what's going to happen to us seeking help. you know, dealing with like issues like, you know, people running away, um, you know, you're told like those things, well, they're, you know, that's a choice, you know, they weren't abducted, you know. Um, but you know, it's fact, you know, we have the numbers to prove, you know, and even our own experiences to say, you know, like with our organization, we've had somebody run away and we've helped their family, and within hours they were with pimps in their area. You know, it's, you know, there are predators that know these things, that know your vulnerabilities. And you know, our we have entire communities that are vulnerable. um and you know, even that I hate to say, because it's not that we're vulnerable by a choice or by the choices we make. It's, you know, we're targeted, you know, because we're, you know, we don't have the resources to come out of bad situations, you know, to come out of poverty, to come out of domestic violence or incest or abuse. And, you know, people don't run away for fun. They're running away from situations that cause harm. And so to have police dismiss runaways and things like that, it's hard to overcome any of the any of your life experience growing up that, you know, set the tone for dealing with police. um yeah, it's just, you know, just dealing with who is policed. um you know, it's a hard thing to talk about. It's a hard thing to understand if you haven't dealt with being policed in those ways. You know, you're literally your body and what you look like being policed. um it's just it's yeah, it's a lot. It's um it's a lot to have shaped your entire life. Yeah, and I you know, yeah, I'll stop there and let the gentleman add to that.
So I suppose I'll go next. Growing up, I grew up in a very different context. I grew up middle class, you know, upper middle class. I grew up in an area really around UTD. And it's funny seeing the differences in how, you know, even though I came up in the same areas as a lot of my white contemporaries, I never had the same opinions on police that they did. Because I always saw and I was always taught to be afraid of the police. And that wasn't a product of my parents being paranoid. That was a product of them trying to survive. My dad, again, was a Dallas firefighter, and he saw how police behaved with a lot of the people that they'd arrest. There were a few stories, more than a few stories he's told me. And this is a story that I would ask not to be repeated too much because, again, I don't want any blowback on my dad. But speaking to mental health, he was saying he was a paramedic a couple of decades ago. There was a lady who was having a crisis and who was about to commit suicide. She had a knife to her chest. And my father, he ended up telling me that when he walked in, he saw a whole bunch of officers sitting there with guns pointed at the lady about to commit suicide. And they were like, why would you point guns at somebody who's having a crisis like this? She's about to hurt herself. She's not about to hurt you all. He ended up saying that a couple of his coworkers had to go up behind her and kind of grab her and tackle her. And it's like, that was really a good view on how policing happens and with people with mental illnesses. And beyond that, even living in the area that I lived in, there were a lot of experiences I had where my father had to teach me, you can't do the same things that your white friends do. I remember in 5th grade, I don't know, a lot of people, you might be a little too old or you might know, there were airsoft guns. Airsoft guns, they looked like regular weapons, but they would shoot out these little pellets. It was just air-propelled weapons. I remember one of my friends, this was in 5th grade, his name was Zach. He was like, hey man, come over to the park. We're gonna go play with airsoft guns. And then me, I was kind of walking out the door like, okay, Dad, I'm gonna go play with airsoft guns. He's like, you going what? You ain't gonna play with no airsoft guns up there. And at the time, I thought that was so ridiculous. I'm like, Dad, everything is about race with you. This is me being a 5th grader. I didn't know any better. But then Tamir Rice happened. And it puts things into perspective. And it's like, he was playing with an airsoft gun and he ended up getting gunned down within seconds. And he didn't even get the chance to answer any questions. My brother used to love to walk with his friends to 7-Eleven. Oh, we're just gonna go to 7-Eleven, we're gonna pick up Arizona. And then, you know what I'm saying, we get all of these cases. All of these cases are just counterpoints to all of our arguments for why these things don't affect us. Trayvon Martin happened and he's sitting there like, my brother can't even say anything anymore because he realizes now, this isn't something that my dad says happens. This is something that does happen. And I think a lot of people, even in college, There was another occurrence I had in college with another set of roommates that I actually had earlier this year. There was one occurrence where basically our neighbors left a note on our door because my roommates would smoke a lot in the apartment. And they basically said, hey, if you don't stop smoking here, we're going to call the police. So me sitting there, I'm like, okay, that's it. Like, bet. I told them, I'm like, yeah, y'all need to chill. Like, okay. And to me, that's understood. But to them, they heard that and they're like, okay, well, we need to buy a smoke inhalation device which conceals the smoke so they won't know we're smoking. And it was at that moment that I'm like, these people exist in a completely different reality than I do. Because me, as soon as police even get threatened to show up, fun's over. It's a wrap. Like, okay, we're chilling. Like, that's cool. But for them, it's how can I get around accountability for it? How can I buy something to get around having an interaction with the police? And that's another thing that this is going to be my last point, but when I was in those handcuffs and I was with those police officers, there is a level of helplessness that you, as someone who hasn't had any interactions with the police, can't understand. Because as soon as them police grab you, they take you up, anything that they do, you're at their mercy and you can't do anything about it. And that's the level of terror and helplessness that I think if there's one thing that I can communicate to my non-Black, non-Indigenous, non-Latino, non-minority people in this call is that this is not something that is just on the news. This is something that is inflicting real trauma, and it paints the way that we see police in our communities, and it paints the way that we interact with police. So don't look at the people who look at police with disdain and reprimand them, reprimand the system that's in place that allows them to subjugate people that look like us.
Thank you so much, Bryson. And so Chris and Sarah, given that we have some questions in the chat and there's only 8 minutes left, so I'll direct the next question to y'all so that you have some time to field some questions. So there's 2 questions and you can choose to take one or the other or simply see if you want to talk about them at the same time. I think they're related, right? So on the one hand, there's a question about economic inequality, right? And how economic inequality seems makes policing worse, right? As for people who are not straight, cis, white, Protestant here in the US. So the question asks, how can we improve that? Right, remedy economic inequality as a way to, and could that be a way to remedy police violence? And the second question is about creating a safer Dallas. The question is, what work is being done on the ground now to create a safer, to create that experience of safety that we've been talking about. So I'll leave that to Chris and Sarah.
So these are both really great questions, and I don't want to take up the whole 8 minutes, so I'll be really, really fast. So what has happened is over time, and I would say particularly post-Reagan, where Reagan really pushed this philosophy of government doesn't need to social safety net. And so by completely divesting and gutting the social safety nets that existed from within our governmental context, what that has created is the needs didn't go away, just the social safety nets went away. And so nonprofits really came up at around the same time to fill in those gaps, but cannot fill in the fullness of what our communities need. And so along with these 2 factors, you have policing becoming the first policy response, the first resort to dealing with crisis points in our community. So there will always be crisis points. There will always be points of tension and things that require intervention. But the question is, what type of intervention? What should be our first resort policy response? And so when you talk about economic inequality, what happens is by creating, when you have a community that has such disparate impact, what's the word I'm looking for? When you have such a disparate impact for certain communities in terms of access to opportunities, et cetera, then it creates a context where people have to commit crimes to meet basic needs, crimes of poverty. And then you criminalize those things instead of meeting those basic needs, and then police become those first interveners. So really where we are right now is in a point where across the country, and including in North Texas and Dallas and Collin County, people are saying we do not want policing to be the intervention of first, the policy intervention or the first resort. We want the police to be the last resort. So what are the alternatives to police to meet the needs of our communities? So really quickly, ways to get engaged. There are coalitions and groups out there, Our City, Our Future. Maybe Jody can drop in the chat. We have a survey going around where we're asking folks, what do you need in your community to feel safe? What do you want in your community? And from that information, we're building what we're calling the People's Budget as an advocacy tool to fight for the resources that we need to make policing obsolete in our community. There's also a coalition called In Defense of Black Lives that you can find on all social media platforms that are pushing for the same things, as well as a policy platform called 10 New Directions that Our City, Our Future has been instrumental in creating. These are all ways that we are trying to create a context for a different type of response. So I promised I wouldn't talk too long, and I still talked a lot, but hopefully that answered some of your questions. But please continue to reach out to me. I'll put my contact in the chat box so we can continue this conversation beyond this moment.
Yes, I'm gonna be real brief, real quick. I say to answer the economical question, thank you, because I'm an econ major. I'm an econ major as well. So I think it was John Crusoe, the Dallas DA, who, when I was sitting in a meeting with him, he asked, a bunch of officers. It was like if he stuck 300 of the police officers and their families on an island where there was only enough resources, there was only enough living space, enough food, enough farming spots and everything. It was only enough resources to maintain 100 people, to only maintain 100 people. And if they try to maintain any more than 100, then the whole island is going to evaporate. Like, everyone's going to die because you can't maintain more than 100 people. And, the officer was like, well, my family's going to have a spot. My family's going to have a spot. My family's going to have a spot. And, John Crusoe was like, well, that's what all the other officers are thinking. All 300 people are saying, my family's going to have a spot. And when it came down to it, the officer was like, well, I'm going to do what I have to do to make sure my family have a spot. And then I quickly, it was just for me, I said, you just described Oak Cliff. You just didn't Grove. You just described my city in Dallas, where you stuck over 1,000, 2,000 individuals in a small area where there's only enough resources to house 100, and expected us to say, here you go, survival of the fittest. You just turned my city into the jungle. So the survival of the fittest. Whoever got the biggest stick, whoever got the biggest guns or whatever, wins. They get the most resources. Instead of saying, okay, we're gonna put enough resources for everybody to thrive. So I think number one is we need to provide more resources in the community for everyone to thrive. Not just survive, where people live in paycheck to paycheck, but what's happening is people are stealing, and it's not because they're stealing because they want to steal it. People are stealing from grocery stores. Why? They don't have food on the table. People are stealing clothes. Why? Because they don't have clothes to wear. People are doing all these things. Why? It's resources. So if you provide people with resources, or even provide people with, let's say, livable wages where they can pay their rent, pay their bills, pay their car note, pay car insurance, which we have to have, and then give them enough money where they can literally go have a little fun, then maybe people, watch the crime rate just simply go down. And then I'm gonna end there. But talking about what we can do, what's happening now, I work with an organization called Faith in Texas. We have a campaign called Road to Liberation, where we are actively looking at, defunding some things that the government, we're actually looking at defunding the mass incarceration industry, so the jails and prison system, and cutting some of those budgets off and putting it back into the community, putting it back into society. So you can get involved with Faith in Texas as well. We're actually moving on our campaign called Road to Liberation. I myself, and like I said, I'm engaged with students and universities to get students and more young people involved into the work, getting bright ideas from them. So if whoever I got to send a link for Faith in Texas to, I will definitely do that. That way they can drop it in the chat box. But I see I went 1 minute over, and that will be my spiel.
Thank you so much, Chris. And there's never enough time. I'm really regretting that we were so rushed, but hopefully this was a launching pad for future conversations. If you're on the email list, you will get a follow-up email with resources and action items. I know we also got a question on what students at UTD specifically can do around these issues. So we will also include links and resources about ways to get involved, ways to mobilize for students specifically. Make sure you're on that email list so that you can get a follow-up email from us with all the links that have been mentioned in the conversation: Faith in Texas, Our City, Our Future, In Defense of Black Lives, and other books and resources that you can consult. I want to thank again Jody and Chris, Bryson, and Sarah for joining us today. I want to thank y'all for being here and tuning in. I also hope that you'll take a quick hour, a little lunch break, check your email, take a walk, and then come back and rejoin us at 2:30 for a conversation on holidays, on history, holidays, monuments, and memory. But thank you again so much to our contributors. I know that I will be thinking about what was said for days to come. Please do stay tuned for future teach-ins. And until 2:30, I hope you're well, and we'll see y'all soon. Thank you again so much.